And can I ask folks in the audience, if you can see and it's not too small, what do you see in terms of some patterns or similarities with the images? Any things stand out to you in terms of similarities across the images? And while you're thinking, I should just also add that these were made 6 months between one another. Version 3 was in about August or so 2022, and then version 4 of Midjourney was released around Christmas or so of 2022, the end of the year. And I generated the same prompts again 6 months later to see how consistent or dissimilar the results were from the prompts. One of the audience members is observing they look like they're all from the last century, especially some of the ones in the bottom left quadrant. A lot of anachronistic imagery going on here, drawing on old school tools of the trade, printing presses, old school cameras, that kind of thing. So there's not really perhaps a lot of defining features of what a journalist looks like in the digital age. And so AI is trying to help us get the point that this is journalism we're trying to represent by drawing on these old school tools to make this point a bit more clear. And one other thing I might mention is, I think almost everywhere you look in these images, all the folks appear as light-skinned individuals. So there's a bit of a racial bias there, or an ethnic background bias. All the folks, as you can see them, seem to be able-bodied. There's not necessarily an even distribution of gender. And if we go ahead and highlight the folks who appear to be more feminine looking, very few of them are on the specialized roles side of the equation. So I think you can see here some of the biases in terms of how AI thinks women are fit for certain roles or not fit for certain roles. I think it's very interesting. Also, it might be a bit small for folks to appreciate, but all the wrinkles and the gray hair in the sample are shown on the mid. We don't see any women with wrinkles or gray hair. So interesting also bias about who can have wrinkles and gray hair. Can women have them? According to AI, no. So this was a really interesting kind of initial exploration for me to dive into the AI-generated content side of the equation and see how AI is visualizing these different journalistic roles. With that early work, we published a journal article, as academics do. We also published an article in The Conversation to try to make our findings a bit more accessible for a public general audience. We talked about some of the biases in addition to things like gender distribution and role distribution with gender, in addition to things like ethnic background bias. Things like a lot of the images were in urban environments. There weren't lots of regional or rural environments being imagined with these prompts. So AI is filling in a lot of the gaps that we're not specifying in our prompts. We're not saying we want a particular type of image or person. In this example, we're just giving it a simple noun, and AI is having to fill in a lot of the gaps, and in doing so is reproducing biases because of its training data. We can talk more about that in a bit. So that was the first kind of work in 2022, looking at AI-generated content. Then, the next year rolls around, 2023, I tried to shift my focus from looking at AI-generated content to looking at the people involved in dealing with AI-generated or AI-edited content, and particularly people in newsrooms and news organizations and how they're perceiving and reacting to these disruptions in generative visual AI. So through some support by the QUT Digital Media Research Center, thank you QUT, we were able to interview news editors and other roles in newsrooms here in Australia and in my home country, the States, and we published these results in Journalistik, which is a German English language journal, and that gives us a little bit of context from these initial findings on how people are perceiving this technology in newsrooms. So that was our first output from that early work in 2023. And then it was a bit of a busy year. I was over in Europe last year for 2 months. My partner was very patient to have me away from home for more than 2 months. Thank you, Dane. Very kind of you. I was over in Europe at the Weizenbaum Institute in Berlin. And for folks who are computer sciencey or a bit of computer nerds, you might have heard of Joseph Weizenbaum. He's a really famous thinker and developer of computer technology, but really famous for his books as well. And in one of his books, he argues a central kind of thesis of his book is that computers and machines are really good at calculating and predicting, but in his view, they're incapable of judgment. And he thinks that judgment is a human quality. It requires values and creativity and attributes that make us human. So he was saying that machines can predict and calculate, but they don't have judgment. He's also known for being the first person to make a chatbot back in the 60s. But that was one of his really central arguments that I think is a nice thing to remember or to play with and to dialogue with. Is that still true, 40 years later after he wrote that book? So while I was at the Weizenbaum Institute, I was able to interview journalists and news workers in Germany, as well as in other countries. As we can see there at right, I was able to supplement my insights from Australia and the States with insights from journalists in France, Germany, Norway, the United Kingdom, and Switzerland. Over the course of a few months, I was able to talk to 20 journalists from 16 news organizations in those 7 countries, and I'll be able to share with you very shortly tonight some results from those conversations. I'll try to keep things brief and short. We won't have time to get through all the nitty-gritty detail, but hopefully we can have some time for questions at the end if you have things that I failed to address. So, focusing on AI-generated content in 2022, focusing on people involved in AI-generated content in 2023, and this year, in 2024, what's to come? Well, 2 things. One is I'll be back in Europe again in July at KAIS, the Center for Advanced Internet Studies in Bochum, Germany, to do a bit of work on audiences and how news audiences perceive generative AI and the place of generative AI in journalism. Because we focus a lot, I think, on content and on journalists who work with content, but what do the audiences, the all-important audiences, think? What are their thoughts about ethics and how this technology should or should not be used? So that audience-focused work will be coming in July through September this year. And for any folks on the Zoom who are in Melbourne, we also have another opportunity on March 16th here in Melbourne through ACME, the Australian Centre for the Moving Image. We'll be showing this little exhibition called Generative Vision. This exhibition highlights 10 examples of generative AI in journalism, how it could be used, and it asks audiences to rate the ethics of those examples on a 7-point scale, from 1, not acceptable at all, to 7, this is pretty good. So if you are around Melbourne on the 16th of March next month, do stop into ACME for that event if you'd be so kind. So tonight, I'll share with you some of the results from that research in Europe, those 7 countries worth of journalists at those 20 different news organizations. I had 2 research questions that were guiding this work. The first one was focused on perceptions, and we don't have time tonight to get into the perceptions data, but beyond perceptions, also I was curious about what do journalists and news editors, photo editors, those types of roles see as the challenges and opportunities of generative visual AI. So that's the first question, challenges and opportunities. And we'll focus first on challenges and then hopefully end up on a bit of a lighter note, opportunities, and leave us with some creative pro-social ways to use the technology at the end of the presentation. My second research question for folks who are more policy wonks or interested in governance of the internet was focused on, do you have policies as a newsroom that govern the use of AI in your organization? And if you don't have policies yet developed, what kind of principles can you point to or identify that might inform policy development going forward? We might not have time to get to policy data either, but we'll see how we go with time. I think it's important to give you just a bit of context about the sample, the attributes and characteristics of the sample, so that you can appreciate the findings in a bit more granular detail. I don't have permission from the outlets to identify them. I promised my participants confidentiality, but I can tell you the range of countries represented in them and a little bit about them in terms of the size or scale or focus of the organizations. So you can see here we have a few national broadcasters in the sample, we have a few internationally focused organizations, a few nationally focused news organizations, 1 nonprofit, and 1 regional conglomerate. So primarily, these are larger organizations with probably hundreds or thousands of employees compared to, dozens of employees. We're primarily looking at these national or international organizations a little bit larger on the scale of things. So let's start off with challenges. By and large, the most overwhelming challenge that journalists identified for generative visual AI being used or being reacted to in journalism was the potential for misleading or deceiving audiences. the potential for mis or disinformation. And if you've heard the news, you might have heard that the World Economic Forum named the risk of mis and disinformation as the world's greatest short-term risk in 2024. The WEF put that risk above things like climate change, above things like armed conflict. So a really incredibly pressing risk, according to the WEF, for this year. A lot of elections are also happening this year, so it's really critical, I think, that we have reliable, quality, and accurate information to draw on to inform our decision making. And there's also examples we can point to, and some folks in the room are interested in this as well, I've heard. Recently, there was this case where we had synthetic images purporting to be of the Israel-Gaza conflict that were being sold on the Adobe Stock platform without being transparently marked as being AI generated. Some newsrooms throughout the country apparently used and republished these images without that context, and there's definitely that potential there for folks to be misled or deceived when you have things that are AI generated that aren't being transparently communicated as such. Definitely, there's a potential there for misleading and deceiving audiences. So that's a very critical challenge to work through, to be aware of with this technology. Probably unsurprisingly, also, our fears of job loss, displacement of labor, that kind of thing as well. That was a very critical key concern my participants shared with me. So if I show you the next slide, this is the pricing plan for a text-to-image generator, Midjourney. And for the relatively small sum of about $1,200 US, you can get a commercial enterprise-grade subscription to Midjourney for the whole year. You can use as many images as you like. And $1,200, that's not a lot of money for an organization for unlimited generations. That's actually quite modest. If you're a freelancer for the New York Times doing freelance image making, the day rate's about $400 a day or so. So if you're kind of balancing as a business-minded person in the newsroom, should I pay someone to do bespoke work for me at a freelancer rate of $300 or $400 a day, or should I spend $1,200 and invest in a Midjourney subscription for the whole year? It doesn't really make sense just based on dollars alone to go with the freelancer model. But I think if we start looking at quality and content, there's definitely an argument to be made for bespoke images. Because again, how generators are trained, they're great at representing really already famous people. They can really easily generate images of Donald Trump or of the Prime Minister here in Australia very easily, because so much imagery already exists of those people. But if you ask it to generate an image of me or you or someone on the street, it will probably struggle. It'll probably have a really hard time generating an accurate image of a particular person down the street, an ordinary Australian, because of that training data. There's not enough training data of me or you or the person down the street for it to accurately represent them. And our stories matter. People on the street matter. The ordinary Australian matters. If we don't have that represented in our news, that's quite a big issue. So I don't think the solution is to pay a little bit of money and outsource all your image making to AI. I think there's definitely an argument to be made for bespoke imaging. For folks who might not be familiar with generative AI, many generators work by training their models through copyrighted data sources. So generators will crawl the web for stock photography databases and websites. They'll perhaps find screen grabs from movies and cinema, from television shows, from video games, and that's how it learns what things look like, who looks like what, and what things look like, based on those cinema sources, video game sources, those sources in stock photography. So that's a bit of an issue because there's multiple cases raging throughout jurisdictions around the world on who owns copyright for those resulting generations. Because the generators don't often own the data they're using to train their models, so who owns the copyright for the resulting generations is very much an active question in the courts right now. If you're thinking about making AI images and your organization is a bit more risk averse, these two options on the screen are a little bit less risky. Adobe's Firefly and Getty's partnership with NVIDIA both are generative AI platforms and services that have made a point of distinction in the market by saying we're only training our data on either proprietary data we already own or on data we have access to use that's already copyright free or open source or whatever it might be. So if you're thinking about risk, those two are safer from that perspective. Another challenge folks shared with me is that it's really hard to detect whether something comes from a camera or a synthetic generation from a piece of software. And this is not the only example, but this is something that AFP really recently asked me to help them assess. Even though you might be able to assess it with your own naked eye, it's a generated image. And 4,500 people shared this image on Facebook. Who knows how many people saw this image and how many people were misled or deceived by the image. This technology is only going to get more sophisticated when you have images that you really can't tell just with your own eyes if they're being AI generated or AI edited. So issues of provenance and authenticity, they're very hard to grapple with. Folks in Europe are trying to work with forensic software to help folks assess authenticity, provenance, that kind of thing. They have this plugin they developed called Verify, and I'm curious, any folks in the audience have used it already or know of it? Looks like Danielle does. Excellent. Yes, good. Thanks, Danielle. Anyone else know about it? I'm curious to hear your thoughts about how effective it is if you've used it or how to play with it. Some in the audience are saying, yeah, I've used it, but it's so-so in terms of effectiveness. Yeah, so that might be an option, but oftentimes it takes a lot of different options and approaches together to assess the veracity of a particular media item. The much touted Adobe Content Authenticity Initiative and its content credentials is another big player in the authenticity and provenance game. I asked the participants about it, or they volunteered it to me organically, either way, and the kind of feedback overall from them was very lukewarm about the potential, at least right now, of this to be the savior, if you will, of provenance. And the reason why is because it's not just a matter of slapping some kind of credentials on an image or video and saying, this is how it was made and here's how it was edited, if at all, and you have this kind of nice, clear package of the journey of the asset. Content credentials require brand new cameras that have this technology embedded in it. It requires new DAMs or digital asset management systems that can work with content credentials, and it requires new websites that are developed or designed to display the credentials to the audiences. And then once newsrooms invest hundreds of thousands of dollars in new equipment, new digital asset management systems, new website infrastructure, you still essentially have the issue potentially where people are seeing your content not necessarily on your own news websites or apps, but on a third-party website like Facebook or Twitter or X, whatever it is, and they're not getting that content credential at the end of the day when they see that image or that video. So a little bit of hesitation and cautiousness by participants about how this might work in practice because of the quite large investment of resources, both human and capital. We also touched on some of the algorithmic biases on the earlier slides that showed how AI visualizes journalists, but reputational risk is something that's also worth mentioning. In Melbourne recently, when 9 News published this image of Georgie Purcell, it used Photoshop's Generative Expand feature to expand the image to better fit the newscast. That's the image outright on the screen. But in doing so, it added a bit of midriff on Georgie's body that wasn't there in real life. People called out 9 for sexualizing the image. And what we have here is just a little quick 13-second illustration of how this works. What's really important here is how tightly the image was either made in camera or was cropped in post-production. If you have a really loosely composed or cropped image to start with, and you try to expand it just a bit, there's not as much drama going on because you're only expanding it, say, 5%. Photoshop only has to imagine 5 or 10% what goes on beyond the frame. However, when you have this type of more tightly composed image, which is what 9 said it used, and you try to use Generative Expand on it, Photoshop has to imagine a whole lot more about what the person is wearing, what is happening below or beneath the frame. If we show you what is happening here in just these 13 to 15 seconds, we can see we have the original image. We use Generative Expand in Photoshop. We can make the change. We give it a little bit of time to think and generate, and that gives us 3 options there, including some with an exposed midriff. So it's not necessarily Photoshop's fault in a sense. It's more the training data that are being used. So we have to ask ourselves, how are we showing people, women in this case, out there in the real world, in cinema and stock photography websites, that kind of thing, And how are these biases being reproduced in AI? So it's also a social issue. How are we showing women day to day? And how is the technology that we're developing, designing, amplifying these biases? So those are some of the challenges. We also have opportunities, and this is the lighter part of the presentation. How can we use these technologies in more pro-social, creative, and fun ways? Well, journalists I talked to felt most comfortable about using AI for illustrations. And to be clear here, when I talk about illustrations, they're talking about things that are clearly not photorealistic. So things that you can definitely tell are not made by cameras. You can see an example here that my colleague, Professor Daniel Angus, and I wrote for the conversation last year. Last year was a really big year for generative AI. Lots of developments, lots of things happened. Well, where did we get to last year? What were those developments? And what might we expect in this year, in 2024? We did this article together and used Midjourney to create a hero image for this article. AI itself is really hard to visualize. You can take a picture of a computer chip, but it doesn't necessarily tell you it's a story about AI. It can be a story about any kind of computing technology, or any kind of computer or technology-related story. So perhaps using illustrations for topics like AI or for mental health, those kind of things that are really hard to visualize, could be an opportunity to use more painterly visual styles in ways that aren't photorealistic. Another opportunity for using AI is for brainstorming and ideation. Oftentimes, as visual thinkers and people in the newsroom, we have to think about how to visually illustrate really kind of banal and boring stories. Perhaps you can go to generative AI to get some inspiration. In the old days, you might go to Google Images, you might type in a query and ask it to show you images, or you might go to Pinterest and see inspiration from a Pinterest board, but now we have generative AI. You could ask Google Gemini, which used to be Bard. Hey, Gemini, help me brainstorm ideas for how to visualize, say, the Mariana Trench for a news story. Well, the Mariana Trench, as you might know, is one of the deepest places in the Earth. Very few people have ever been there. It's very dark in the trench, very hard to document with the camera. Well, how do you visualize that kind of environment for an audience? So I ask Gemini, and it's giving you some ideas. It's saying maybe you can compare it with the size of Mount Everest or the Burj Khalifa in Dubai, put those more familiar landmarks side by side so you can see the depth of the trench compared to the height of another object like the mountain or the tower in Dubai. Or create a layered illustration where you show the flora and the fauna that live in each depth of the sea. You could have an interactive scrolling experience with that, perhaps. So some interesting ideas there for brainstorming ideation, a number of different ideas. The more efficient aspect is a bit self-explanatory, so we might move ahead to the cheaper aspect. Now, this is an opportunity for the business-minded folks in the newsroom, but a bit of a challenge for the folks who are impacted by the business decisions. This quote on the screen comes to us from colleagues in France. I was interviewing those colleagues in France in newsroom there, and they said that they currently hire a designer to do a lot of bespoke illustrations for the outlet. They say it costs quite a bit to do bespoke illustrations, takes a lot of time, and they say, I'm pretty sure next year we won't use that again. We'll obviously use some AI because it's much cheaper, and the result is almost the same, if not better, and I'm kind of worried about their jobs. So, opportunity perhaps for the newsroom, but challenge definitely for people being impacted, the illustrators in this case. Another opportunity with heaps of possibilities, I think, is the potential to use AI for infographics or data visualizations. So you can ask Gemini to visualize public data already out there. You can say, hey, Gemini, give me a chart of the world's population from this year to this year, and it can do that. Now, do fact check to make sure that the visualizations are correct, as it sometimes can get things wrong, but it was able to do this simple prompt for me because it relied on publicly accessible data out there. You can use Adobe Illustrator's text-to-image feature to generate simple icons or illustrations that can be used as is or as part of larger montages. That's an opportunity perhaps for infographics work. And if you had to think about trying to do a little house, to make a little house on your own with solar panels by hand, It would take you perhaps an hour, maybe less if you're a little bit more skilled, but it would take you a lot of time. And if you can just do that in just a few mere seconds, an icon, that's a really big time saver, a really big efficiency multiplier for newsrooms. And you might remember that story in the New York Times, that story that New York Times did a few years ago when Notre Dame was on fire. They had this beautiful interactive scroll through. You could see this model of Notre Dame and see how the fire spread from one part of the building to another part of the building. It was this lovely interactive spinning model that was really interesting and engaging to look at. Now, I don't know exactly how the Times did it, but I imagine they kind of made that model by hand, taking lots of painstaking time and effort. But I think nowadays, if not now, in a short time, I imagine you can upload to a generative AI service schematics, blueprints, architectural renderings, and get this kind of model built for you very quickly without having all the time for a human to do this painstaking work manually. So I'm thinking, wow, this could be really cool to do this kind of storytelling around models and interactives. Also, the potential exists to use AI to visualize the past or future. So just an example, a random one, I went to the State Library of Western Australia and found this image of the ship Sydney. And I used Runway, a text-to-video animator, and I popped this image in as the base asset. I did a little simple pan command, and it makes the waves move for you. It pans the camera a bit, gives it a bit of motion. And it's an interesting way to think about a historical image, giving it just a little bit of life and dynamism compared to just a still image that might just be scrolled by if it was just seen as a still image by itself in a social media feed. Another opportunity there or idea, you can use AI to replace stock photos. Stock photography in Midjourney, for example, is quite convincing. You can say, I want to see an image of hands on a laptop, and it can return results that look very much like hands on a laptop. There's even 5 fingers on both hands. Midjourney has gotten a lot better with fingers in the last few months. Journalists were a little bit more conservative and cautious with this. Not everyone in the sample said this was a good thing to do. Some of the more features-oriented folks in the department were a bit more comfortable with this compared to folks in the news department who said, let's not do this. This is a bit too close for comfort. We don't want to mislead or deceive folks. And the final slide here, a few other opportunities and use cases, other little outliers here. These were things in terms of data management and processing. Using AI for object recognition, facial recognition, because as a photographer in a former life, you'd have to individually caption everything, apply batch captions, give lots of rich context to the metadata so that the computer knows what images are, what and who are in the images. So if you can have AI look for faces, recognize objects, put those in as keywords, that lets you have a lot faster workflow with your pre-ingestion workflow. It lets you be able to find and sort those assets a lot more easily as well. So enriching metadata using AI through that process, trying to play also with AI for automating layout. Instead of having a designer manually create designs each day for a magazine or printed product, perhaps you have AI automate that process. And again, get inspiration for things like color palettes as well. You can do that with AI too, as we've already demonstrated.